Yo, this is Bench Gamer here. So I have finished the Penacony story from patch 2.0 to 2.2, and I just wanted to let my thoughts sit for a while as well as let everybody else finish the story before I gave my thoughts on Penacony as both a region as well as a story. And from what I've gathered from the ending of 2.2 with the little bit of info about Sunday as well as some official and unofficial, info, I think the next patch is basically just going to be an epilogue. I don't think there's going to be too much in the way of main story gameplay content. I don't think there's going to be any more introductions of, more bosses or Penacony enemies. So it's essentially just going to be wrapping things up when it comes to the IPC involvement in Penacony, and then we're just going to be shuttled off to another area in 2.4. So I think it's okay for me to talk about my thoughts now. So full disclosure, this story review slash rant is going to have a lot of spoilers. So if you have still not done the story, then I suggest you just leave right now if you care about that kind of stuff. Or if you're just here because of my coverage of Genshin Impact and you don't play Honkai Star at all, then maybe just press like and blah blah blah, subscribe, whatever. So okay, let's get into the main gist of what I want to talk about. If you didn't know, this channel originally spawned from complaining about Inazuma. That was the genesis of Bench Gamer as both a name as well as a channel. I complained about Inazuma's story when it first came out and how it didn't really make a lot of sense, how they kind of screwed up Raiden Shogun's characterization, they kind of dropped the ball when it comes to writing the Inazuma like rebellion storyline with Watatsumi, and how it just got kind of shuttled to the side. That was this channel's genesis. I was a story complainer. And ever since then, I've been sort of mellowing out. Ever since the second Raiden Shogun story quest, I haven't really been that incensed by anything that Hoyoverse has written. I don't think anything was actually bad enough for me to just like fully rage out and just like explode in anger. Just a full-on rant about how Hoyoverse can't write for shit. And I think a lot of that is maturation of myself as like a gacha gamer, as well as my understanding of how gacha banners work in tandem with how the stories are written. I think there is a lot more connection between how the story has to be written around banners than the stories actually existing in a vacuum. Like ideally they would be able to both order the banners around the stories as well as write a story that fits the banners in a way that is enjoyable to everybody. But I think in reality, especially for Honkai Star, that's not really going to be the case, because every single patch has to have, two new 5-star characters. Next patch has to do two new 5-star characters, and then probably also a 4-star character. So all of these characters have to be written into the story somehow, and that definitely limits what they can do with the story. So if it comes to, a story having too many characters, or a story not giving every single character the justice that they deserve, I am not really that bothered by that anymore. A lot of this has to do with the fact that Raiden Shogun did eventually, in my opinion, get a complete story arc, and I think every single character is eventually going to get that, at least the important ones. Like for example, Sunday, Akron, Adventuring, all of them got important story arcs in Penacony. So in terms of characterization, I'm not too fussed about this kind of stuff. Even in the Shinjo Lofu, I feel like a lot of the characters got a lot of characterization, if not in the main story quest, then at least in their companion quest. So it's not that much of a big deal for me anymore when characters don't immediately get, a whole bunch of stuff coming their way. But I still do have some reservations about how the stories are written, especially when it comes to the length of the stories, how much dialogue there is, the lack of gameplay. This is the kind of stuff that has kind of bothered me ever since Inazuma, because those are now the problems that are most prevalent in Hoyoverse storytelling. Although I have adapted myself to, bear with them as well as like the stories, despite the existence of these problems, I still feel like they are something that has persisted throughout both Sumeru and Fontaine, and I do kind of regret not talking a bit more about this when Sumeru first came out. So don't just think if I am criticizing, Penacony, that this is a purely Honkai Star thing. I definitely do think that some of the problems that I am talking about here also exist in Genshin Impact. Also, for some problems, it's to a lesser or greater extent. So, okay, let's just get into the main problem. There is too much dialogue in Hoyoverse storytelling now. I have collected information about how much dialogue there is in every single region in both Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail. You're probably going to be shown an infographic here. Mondstadt has 43,000 words in its main story, Liyue 56,000, Inazuma 86,000, Sumeru 131,000 and 133,000. you can see directly how much more dialogue there is in New Hoyoverse stories, and that's the same in Honkai Star as well. The first region, Heart of Space Station, had a mere 18,000 words in its main story. It was barely like part of the main story at all. It was basically just a tutorial. So 18,000 words is nothing like too weird. The first real region was Eurilo 6 with 65,000 words. And then Shinjo Lofu is a bit weird because originally Shinjo Lofu had an entire side mission attached to the main quest called Danshu. And with Danshu, it had 76,000 words, so roughly 11,000 more words than Eurilo 6. But eventually they took out Danshu from the main storyline, and that cut down the amount of dialogue to just 62,000 words below Eurilo 6. And my suspicion about this is that Danshu was just never part of the main story in the first place, and it was upgraded to a main story quest at some point because they needed to pad things out a bit and give the abundance side of things a bit more, nuance. So Shizuo Lofu is actually the first region in both Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail to have less story than a previous region, and I have a lot of theories about why this is, and I might make a video about this later on, but that's not the focus of this video, so let's just ignore that for now. And then we go to Penacony 2.0 to 2.2, and as you can see, similar to Sumeru, it pretty much doubled the size of the previous story. Maybe not doubled, it's like an increase between... Actually, yeah, it did double the story. Eurilo 6 was 65,000 words, and Penacony up to 2.2 is 120,000 now. So including 2.3, it's definitely going to be at least double the size of Eurilo 6, even if you don't count Shinjo Lofu as a main story region. So each patch had 38,000 words, 38,000 words, and 44,000 words. So we know that Penacony is not just a better story, but also a bigger story. I would argue that it is also just a better story compared to the previous regions in terms of my pure enjoyment. I definitely think this is the best region that they have released so far, and the best story that they have told in Honkai Star Rail. And I also think it is the story that I have enjoyed the most since Sumeru, also in Genshin Impact. If I just combine Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail into just like one amalgamation, which I know a lot of you guys probably don't care for because you probably don't play both games at the same time. But let it just be said that this is one of my favorite stories from a pure enjoyment perspective. I think it is a 9 out of 10. But if we are to take like a good look at some of the problems here, the dialogue really has become a problem. And I suspect that this would happen the moment that people started having issues with Shinjo Lofu, because this had a lot of deja vu to me. When I complained about Inazuma, I didn't realize that they would increase the storyline by such a large amount in Sumeru, and I think it ultimately worked out for Sumeru in Sumeru's favor. But then we got to Fontaine, and I feel like not only was there so much dialogue, but a lot of it felt like it was unneeded. Act 3 in particular for Fontaine felt like it was just there for the sake of being there. I didn't really think it added too much to the main story, similar to Danshu's storyline. In fact, I think it had less relevancy to the main Fontaine story than Danshu had to the Shinjo Lofu story. And I was really weirded out when people complained so much about Danshu, whereas they didn't about the third act with Fontaine. But I think one of the reasons for this is because we didn't really have to wait that long for the continuation of that quest. And eventually we did get the ending of Fontaine's story in the next patch, whereas the Shinjo Lofu kind of fucked with the order of how they wanted to release the storyline. We had a gap in between the main story in 1.1, and I think everybody just kind of forgot what actually happened in 1.0. So I do regret not talking more about the increase in dialogue and how that impacted my enjoyment of the game in Sumeru, mostly because I actually really did enjoy Sumeru's story, and I did talk a bit about the bloated dialogue, but it was just kind of like a side thing. Now I'm going to address this directly. The dialogue is definitely a problem. You might enjoy the story, you might think it is good, but the dialogue, if it continues to be this way, is not going to benefit every single story from here on out. Not every single Honkai Star Rail story needs to be this long, and I am afraid that if this continues into the future, into the next main region, then it is going to feel extremely bloated. Because it's not just the dialogue, but I'm going to show you the amount of new enemy types when it comes to new riggings that are introduced in each new faction. Each new region introduces new enemy types that have not been seen in previous regions, and I am only counting the new enemy types that have not been used in terms of their riggings. So these are all of the new riggings that have been added to the game in that region. So the Shinjo Lofu added 6 new riggings, whereas Penacony added 7 new riggings. So the amount of new enemy types being introduced is more than the previous regions, but only one more, whereas the story has increased by up to 2 times of the previous region size. The enemies themselves and the main gameplay content has not. It has not increased in proportion to the dialogue. And this is seen in the main boss encounters as well. Every single region so far, from Belobog all the way to Penacony, has had only 4 main bosses. Belobog had Japard, Svarog, Cocolia, and Cocolia Form 2. And then they just throw in kind of a throwaway boss like Bronia. Shinjolofu was a bit different. It still had only 4 main bosses, but Yinqing didn't really do anything in the main story. He did have his own gameplay mechanics, but it was basically just to show off the existence of Imbiber Lune. And then there was also Sirius in the continuance mission that the other regions didn't have, but he doesn't really get his own attacks. He does have unique abilities and animations, but he's just kind of there, similar to Bronia. They don't really do anything. I think Sirius maybe took a bit more work to create than Bronia, because Bronia doesn't have any unique animations at all as a boss. And again, she was just kind of more like a tutorial. And then we get to Penacony, and I would argue that Penacony bosses are of a higher quality compared to all the 2 previous regions as well. The Death Meme, awesome animation, awesome design. Sam, awesome animation, awesome design. Adventuring, probably my favorite boss in Penacony, the most challenging as well as the most not maybe not the most well thought out, but because he has a lot of RNG attached to his gameplay mechanics. But I just found it so interesting that he was actually challenging as a main story boss. And then Septimus, I think, was a little bit worse than Adventuring in terms of gameplay content. He was much more better presented as a boss with the hype music, and just like fighting a gargantuan angelic statue thing was amazing. But I think it kind of dropped the ball a tiny bit in the 3rd phase, because once I realized that he couldn't really do anything to me as long as I kept breaking the shields and getting more shields for myself, it was kind of like a non-mechanic. And in that way, I feel like Septimus was actually a slight downgrade from Vantilia when it comes to the gameplay mechanics, because Vantilia just kept adding more and more stuff to what she was able to do with single target damage, with like AoE damage, and then blocking your health. She was actually much more threatening as a boss, in my opinion, at the time that she released during the Shinjo Lofu story. So it's not a wholesale improvement. They also added Argenti as like another boss in Penacony, but that's again like reusing previous content, not similar to, but I would compare Argenti in terms of how much effort it took to put them there to like Sirius and Bronia. They barely took any effort. So essentially every single region has 4 bosses. So why is this a problem? Well, with the increase in the story size and the amount of dialogue, the interval between each boss encounter has also increased exponentially. If we like divide the bosses up evenly along the storyline, then basically it takes twice as long to get to a new boss now in Penacony as it did in the Shinjo Lofu and Guerrilla 6. And because of that, people who are casual players who maybe don't want to read, who don't want to listen to all of the dialogue, are not going to be able to finish the story, or they're not going to be as incentivized to finish the story as they were previously. So I have adapted to the way that Hoyoverse storytelling works, so this doesn't bother me that much. But as I was watching other people play the game, I could like viscerally feel, like I could visibly tell that they were being a bit pissed off and they were annoyed. Some of them were like literally screaming and shouting that there was just too much yapping. And I don't want the future of Honkai Star Rail to be this dichotomy between, oh, there's not enough characterization in the story in a la Shinjo Lofu, or oh, there's so much dialogue. This is the only way that we can possibly do things. The main story has to have this much dialogue and this much storytelling for it to feel, complete. One of the things they could do, in my opinion, is to offer us faster reading speed, and just to increase it by 1.5 times so that we don't feel guilty about, we don't want to skip the dialogue, because they obviously put a lot of work into the voice acting. I feel guilty when I skip dialogue, but the storytelling, as well as the way that people speak, with the way that they drag out their sentences, and then they have these weird unnatural gaps between the words that they say, it feels too slow, it feels too dragged out, it feels artificial. They don't talk like normal human beings. So one of the ways that they can fix this is to just give us a faster reading speed option, maybe either 1.25, 1.5, and 2 times speed. Preferably give us 3 options. Genshin Impact would also need this, but Genshin Impact is probably never going to change. Basically, give us 3 options for reading speed so that we don't feel guilty about skipping. Another option is that they could just add more enemy variety and add more like actual gameplay content, maybe add more bosses to the game, to the game's main story, so that the intervals between hype moments do not feel as long. Having combat gameplay moments resets your brain so that you can keep going when it comes to like absorbing information. I think we've all heard at some point in our lives that the human brain only has at maximum like 30 minutes of full attention span, and then they kind of just zone out. Penacony's 2.2 story took me maybe like 12 hours to finish because I didn't skip shit. Aside from just speeding up the story, maybe there is too much opaque language involved. It's not just the amount of storytelling, but also the way that they tell the story. Every single character in Penacony is kind of like keeping their own secrets. That's fine. I think that's the theme of Penacony, but that shouldn't be the case for, every single region that Honkai Star has going forward. I feel like that they've played too much into that, starting from Sumeru on. I feel like Sumeru and Fontaine really kind of like they really zoned in on the idea that Genshin Impact is a game that is about mysteries, that every single region has all these characters with mysteries, and that there is like a main mystery to each region that you have to figure out, like a puzzle box. Like you have to fit all these like little puzzle pieces, and then it all eventually comes together into like this gigantic monstrosity of a story. Honkai Star's Penacony is definitely like that, but in addition to that, it's just it might be a little bit too much. Like Gallagher has secrets. Firefly has secrets. Adventuring has secrets. Misha has secrets that he didn't know about, and then he kind of revealed. Sunday has secrets. Robin kind of doesn't have secrets, to be honest. Oh, I didn't think about that. But too many characters. Black Swan has secrets. So everybody in Penacony has their own secrets, and they're all trying to hide something from you. But the way that they talk makes it feel like they talk like, oh, you don't know what I know, and I know what you don't know, and you're going to have to figure out what I know that you don't know. And it feels like we're trying to play a game where I don't want to be part of the game anymore. They're trying to like bait me into like being interested in what they have to say, but I feel like what they have to say is ultimately not that interesting. When it comes to how it fits into the overall story. For example, the final conflict with Sunday ultimately didn't factor adventuring too much into it, did it? Like adventuring got so much screen time in patch 2.1. Both him as well as Sparkle, I feel like, as well as Black Swan, ultimately didn't do too much in the final conflict. I actually feel like Black Swan did more for the final conflict than either Sparkle or Adventuring, but both of them got pretty significant screen time, in my opinion, more so Adventuring. And having characterization itself is not bad. Like, obviously, Adventuring is a character that everybody cares about now. Okay, maybe not everybody, but he is the most, maybe not well characterized, but thoroughly characterized characters and units in Honkai Star so far. And that has been a problem that Honkai Star has had since the beginning of the game, which is that there is no single character, in my opinion, in Honkai Star that has had as much characterization as a Genshin Impact character, especially when it comes to Archons, even including Adventuring. So I'm glad that they are finally giving like single characters that much focus. And in addition to Adventuring, I think Acheron got a lot of screen time. Sunday got a lot of screen time. But I also think that fact that all these characters got so much development was actually also a detriment to Penacony's story, because I don't think all of these characters needed that much development inside the main story. And I think what happened was that they feared a repetition of Shinjo Lofu, where they put so much of the character development inside the companion missions that people who only did the main story mission didn't really get a sense of their characterization. People complained that, Dan Hun was kind of rushed, and the other characters don't have really that much like character to them. Like Fushun didn't really do anything. We didn't really get a sense of what her personality was like. Yukon really didn't do anything, and then all these characters, Xingque didn't really do anything. And I would argue that most of them actually did get a lot of substantial characterization, but just not in the main story. They just got it in like the side quests, like Orm Alley, like the Fixestral, whatever garden it's called. I actually really liked that event. That was one of the best story like events of all time in both Genshin and Honkai Star. And then Danhun got his own companion mission. So did Yukong. So did Bailu. But arguably, those stories could have been part of the main story, and they could have worked just as well as some other companion missions like Lochas didn't really make much sense once you had finished the main story, because it was already revealed that he was part of the conspiracy to take the Stellaron aboard the starship. So they probably wanted to just, put that stuff that they were going to put in companion missions into the main story. And that's why you don't really see too much companion missions in Penacony anyways. Like there was one companion mission for Sparko and Black Swan in 2.0, but after that, both 2.1 and 2.2 completely lack companion missions. And I want to talk a bit more about that later on. But essentially what I'm getting at is that maybe they could have focused in more on a couple of characters that were more relevant to the final conflict, maybe like Robin, and kept things more focused so that it didn't feel as convoluted. And then make those characters really, really drive home that these characters are what are important, so that we don't feel like, oh, we're in this patch and now it's adventuring story, and in the next patch, oh, we never talked to Robin before. We talked to her like 2 times, but suddenly it's 2.2 and it's Robin and Sunday time. Whereas 2.0 was a Firefly time, and then in Firefly didn't really do anything in 2.2 because it's not her patch, and she has to wait until 2.3 before she becomes relevant again. Remember what I said about how the story has to reflect the banners? Well, it's not banners, it's not Firefly's banner, so she doesn't get to do anything in 2.2. I think that is a very big weakness of Honkai Star Rail's story, even in Penacony, which is that Honkai Star Rail's story adheres to the banner order so much, whereas Genshin Impact sort of doesn't really care about what banners are. Genshin Impact does care, but it doesn't care to the extent where they have to order the story so that XYZ character has to be, their plot relevant stuff has to come inside of the patch that their banner is in. So obviously Arlecchino did stuff in Fontaine's main story before her banner came out. Obviously Clorin did some stuff. Actually, she didn't actually do that much stuff in Fontaine's main story. She was kind of just a throwaway character. But obviously, she didn't have to have her banner be during the main story for her to exist in the main story. And I think that has been a problem with Honkai Star Rail for a long time, which is that their story has to match their characters, because every single new patch has to have 2 new 5-star characters. So even if they delayed the release of certain characters like Sunday, they still have to give him substantial story time. And there will always be 2 new 5-star, 2 new 5-stars, and 1 4-star that have to be written into the story. And it's just a breakneck pace. There's no real way to fix this unless they literally just stop releasing so many new 5-star characters, which I hope they do in the future. But for the foreseeable future, that doesn't seem to be the case. We've all seen the rumors. Well, at least I've seen the rumors, and the 2 new 5-star, 1 new 4-star patch cycle format seems to be something that they plan on keeping for a very, very long time. There are theories as to why that is. Maybe it's because it takes less work to create Honkai Star Rail characters than it does to make Genshin characters, but it is what it is, right? I also think the lack of companion missions in Penacony so far is indicative of a broader reallocation of resources to focus more on the main story, rather than just a wholesale increase in an improvement in just the production budget and value of Penacony in general and Honkai Star Rail. What I mean by this is that a lot of the parts of the story as well as the game that are not about Penacony's main story have kind of fallen to the wayside. I've noticed that Penacony's story, especially in 2.1, had a lot of mistranslations. Some genders were mistranslated, and this isn't one of those like, oh, rage, they mistranslated he as she or she as he because they were like SJWs or some shit. No, they were literally just mistranslated, and they fixed it going forward in the 2.2 patch. I believe they have, at least. And this is related to how Misha is depicted. I think in one sequence when we were with Firefly and then we met Akron and Misha and Clocky, I think Firefly referred to Misha as he, even though she wasn't supposed to see him because she's not a trailblazer. So that was fixed. And then in some other places where I think it was Aventurine referring to a certain mute, he referred to the person as a he, even though it was supposed to be Firefly. So they fixed that as well. And then in some other places, there were some mistranslations or just not translated at all. For example, in the final cutscene between Gallagher and Sunday in 2.1, Sunday accused Gallagher of being a minion of the Enigmata, but that was never translated initially, and that was just completely missing in the first day of the patch. And then eventually they added the text in, but they didn't add the voiceovers until 2.2. So there are just a lot of weird like idiosyncrasies and mistranslations and just mistakes going on in Penacony that I didn't notice before in in Shinjo and Belobog. And I would have noticed them because I play this game in both Chinese as well as English. So I tend to notice something when there's a very big discrepancy. And I never noticed that in previous regions. I know there are mistranslations and problems with the translation in previous regions and the like minutiae of the information they're trying to get across. But Penacony is the first region where there were very big like misses in terms of what they were supposed to translate. There was another part of the story where Sparkle was referring to Robin as well as Firefly when she told Aventurine to make friends with mutes. She said in the English version that Aventurine should make friends with rocks, but those rocks turned out to be Robin and Firefly. And obviously, the translator didn't get the full extent of the story. Maybe because they were trying to, keep leaks from getting out, which didn't really work in the first place because this entire story was leaked like months in advance of the official launch of Penacony. So it was just it was completely nonsensical. They should have just given the translator the entire story to translate so that they actually had some way to understand what the relevance of that passage was and what its relevance was in the full in the full scope of the story. And the reason why they obviously mistranslated it is because they didn't have all of the story. They were probably just given 2.0 story to translate and then 2.1 story to translate and then 2.2, which is why 2.2 had the least amount of translation issues for as far as I can see. And even then they still had problems because this is only in the English version, but when you fight not Aventurine, but Argenti in the main story, he actually doesn't have any voiceovers because apparently that was a bug. So there's I don't think this was a bug, but when you talk to Aventurine during his self-reflection moment in 2.1 and he was showing you the Aventurine cornerstone, there was also a discrepancy between the image that they showed of the Aventurine stone being as well as what the 3D model showed. Because when he showed the Aventurine stone, it was supposed to be shattered because that's how he got the Aventurine stone with him inside of the bag because so that other people wouldn't notice it. But when he actually showed the image of the Aventurine stone, it was not shattered. And then when he was doing his animation, his cinematic like power up move, it was shattered. So I don't know what was up with that. It's just like a little small thing that kind of confused me. Why was it shattered in the cutscene but not shattered in the image? And there's all of these like little discrepancies that make me feel like certain parts of the story probably got they didn't get as much attention as the dialogue as well and the main story writing. And the increase in the story's length did not come with a proportionate increase in the quality control of other parts of not just the story but just the game in general. Again, there are no more companion missions, and if you've noticed, the main events that we have had in Penacony also no longer have any voiceovers. I'm sure that they're going to give us a continuance mission for Penacony as well as maybe like another event, and maybe those will have voiceovers. But these two events are basically equivalent to the Orm Alley and Museum events in Belobog and the Shinjo Lofu, and both of those events had voiceovers, whereas these events, which also change the map in permanent ways, similar to Orm Alley and Museum, these don't have voiceovers. And it's not like a big thing. Obviously, I can just read, I can use my eyes, but it feels like the budget for other parts of the game that aren't the main story got slashed, and those resources that would have gone into those parts of the game were reallocated to the main story rather than just, increasing the budget for every single part of the game. And I wonder why that is. I wonder why they don't they often make me feel like Honkai Star Rail is an experimental product. It's not like a fully thought out product like Genshin Impact. It feels like they're experimenting all the time with what they want the Honkai Star Rail story to be, and some of it can be good. I think Penacony turned out more good than bad ultimately, but it makes me feel anxious about where the story is going. It makes me feel like they haven't thought out where the story is going to end, and whereas Genshin Impact already gave us the entire outline for where we're going in the story, and there's nothing to like really talk about. We're going to Natlan next, and then in Honkai Star Rail, it feels like not everybody is. I feel like I can't guess where the story is going, especially in the Shinjo Lofu story, because they set things up to the extent where this has to be picked up, or else it's not going to make any sense whatsoever. And so there are little tidbits of what I think is going to happen in the future of the story, but not everybody is going to pick on that kind of stuff because they don't really understand how live service games work. For a lot of people, this is their first live service game. For a lot of people, this is their first gacha game. They don't understand how gacha storytelling works and how they set things up, even if it's set up really badly. Example, Shinjo Lofu. So I feel like they need to give us more assurance as to the idea that they know what they're doing. And give us more quality control, give us more evenness in terms of how the story is presented. It would be really weird if the next main region didn't have as much story as Penacony, but this is not me asking for them to decrease the amount of content in the story. I'm asking for them to raise the quality control as well as the production value of all parts of the game rather than just the main story. Again, I feel like Penacony was definitely more good than bad, but I also feel like the main story fell apart in some places and it didn't really get across what it wanted to get across. I don't think Robin's ideology, for example, was as well developed as Sunday's. Sunday really beat us over the head with multiple instances of him talking just like to himself, him talking about the bird on and on and on about the bird. The bird analogies and metaphors were just over the top. I think he showed us the bird like 3 or 4 times, and then Robin also showed us the bird like 2 or 3 times. So we got a lot of bird analogies, but I don't think Sunday's ideology was refuted nearly as well as it was presented to us, because at the end of the story there was a moment after we defeated the boss and it was the cinematic was playing where Sunday asked us, why does life slumber? And then the Trailblazer said something like, we sleep because we wake up. And I know what they're trying to get at. I know that it's supposed to mean something and that there are all sorts of like different interpretations of what that could mean that you could impose on that line, as well as the metaphors and like allusions that why does life slumber could mean. But it just doesn't sound like it's meaningful. It doesn't sound good because they haven't given us as much time to like grasp what the Trailblazers' ideology as well as Robin's ideology is. So it feels a bit shallow. It feels like they're basically saying people die when they are killed. It feels like one of those moments that, yes, it probably does mean something in the context, but that context has not been thoroughly developed enough for me to, not find it funny. And the entire conflict itself with Sunday about how Sunday was trying to get us into this dream world so that we can fulfill our own like dignified destinies inside of a dream instead of living out a cruel life in reality. I think that plot point in particular, which is basically the final conflict, is a bit too played out in basically every single genre. I think Madara literally tried to do the same thing with the infinite Tsukuyomi in Naruto. There's like a couple of Evangelion tried to do something similar as well with like a collective hive mind thingamabob, the LCL and the Tanging. There was also Code Geass. I think like Lelouch's dad tried to do something similar to that so that he could reunite with his like dead wife or something. Oh yeah, and also Persona 5 Royal. That was the main one. Sunday and Maruki from Persona 5 Royal could probably switch places and there would be no difference between them. I'm probably making this out to be a bigger issue than it is, but I really do feel like Penacony's story in particular is a bit more derivative than pretty much every single story that I have experienced in Genshin Impact and Honkai Star. I feel like there is always like a certain shtick that subverts expectations in each region and story. For example, the Belobog story was like a post-apocalyptic Eastern Europe, and then at the very end, when we thought we had defeated the big bad, and then everything was going to be all well and okay again, then like Bronya throws something at us like, oh, we have to lie to the people. And there's just this little subversion of expectation that makes me more interested in the story than it would have been if it was just a fully shonen-esque story. And then there was the Shinjo Lofu story, which was a subversion of the Xinsha genre in China, where the Xinsha genre basically like makes it so that the main character is looking for immortality. He's trying to ascend and like cultivate himself. Whereas in the Shinjo Lofu, you don't want to be a cultivator because immortality bad. So there's all of these little subversions there as well. And then I think the regions themselves in Genshin Impact are the character. So like Techno Egypt has been done before, but like Techno Iran and Middle East, in addition to the forest environment, I don't think that has been done too much in pretty much any genre. I think the entire region is kind of devoid of any depictions in general when it comes to Western media. So it feels fresh. And then in Fontaine, we have a subversion of the usual format in Genshin Impact stories where we fight a Fatui agent and Harbinger of some kind and then a big bad. Whereas in Fontaine, it was mostly low key. The Harbinger really didn't really want to fight us, and then we fought in like a beast type sort of thing that was not really even the final villain because he just turned out to be the pet of some other higher being. So there are all of these little things that hooked me onto the story that stick out and seem different from the genre that they're just basically cribbing from. Whereas Penacony, I don't think there has been anything like that in Penacony, despite all of the twists and turns that they have given us. I feel like ultimately the conflict itself is very derivative, and the premise of the story and the conflict is maybe playing a bit too closely to the genre that they're cribbing from. And it's just too on the nose. It feels like it was ripped straight from Persona 5 Royal. I don't think the story would have changed drastically if Sunday was switched out with Maruki. They could literally just like isekai Maruki from Persona 5 Royal and then like put Sunday into Persona 5 Royal as well, and they could have done each other's jobs just as well. And in addition to that, again, I don't think Robin and the Trailblazer ideology were developed nearly as well. So that made the final resolution of conflict feel a bit unearned. It feels like we won because we were the good guys and that was basically it. We didn't beat him in ideology. We weren't more right than he was. We were just the Trailblazers. So, fuck him, I guess. If I'm being honest, I think a lot of my enjoyment of Penacony as well as Honkai Star Rail in general probably has more to do with the hype boss fight moments rather than the actual storytelling. It's not that the storytelling is bad, but I don't think the storytelling is what separated Honkai Star Rail from Genshin for me in the first place. I don't think Genshin's storytelling is inferior to Honkai Star Rail's, and it's not the reason why I started falling off from Genshin in the first place. It was because Genshin Impact simply does not have the amount of gameplay I find enjoyable in the main story anymore, and because Genshin did not have endgame content. But now that we do know that Genshin is getting endgame content at last, even if it's not, actually good, it is still endgame content at the end of the day, and by default, that makes it closer to Honkai Star Rail in terms of my enjoyment. I feel like the momentum has swung in the other way, and because Honkai Star Rail's story is also ballooning to the same size as Genshin Impact's without increasing the amount of gameplay. And when I say gameplay, I don't mean puzzles. I mean like actual combat gameplay. I feel like it is in danger of reaching the same status of Genshin Impact when it comes to the main story, when it comes to the amount of stuff that is preferably kept more concise. I don't think that every single region should have the same kind of opaque storytelling, opaque dialogue, and the amount of dialogue, the same amount of dialogue as Honkai Star Rail. And that is something I am regretful of not complaining about more when Sumeru first released. And that's that the story has just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger without feeling like it needs to be. Penacony's story does not feel like it needs to be this large. It feels like it's this large because that's what they felt was necessary to write what they felt like was wrong in the Shinjo Lofu. It feels like it's big for the sake of being big rather than for the sake of actual good storytelling. I don't think that having so much info being repeated over and over again was good for the story. I don't think we needed 6 different instances of the dove or the Charmony bird being mentioned. They were beating us over the head with Sunday's ideology. Meanwhile, Robin didn't really get as much characterization as she needed, and she probably could have used a story quest in the same way that Genshin characters got a story quest, which is how they even out the amount of, storytelling and characterization that each character has, even if they don't get as much screen time in the main story missions. That's why we can feel like we can pull for Clorin from a story standpoint without having to feel like we're being cheated out of something because we know we're getting a story quest for her rather than her just being a side bit character in the main story. Because realistically, there will always be characters that get less attention in the main story, even with as much storytelling as there is in Penacony. So I hope that they give us the companion missions back in the future. I hope they give us different reading speeds for the dialogue. I hope that they make the storytelling less opaque and they don't feel like it's necessary for future regions to be as much of a mystery as Honkai Star Rail is doing in Penacony. That is my hope for the future of Honkai Star Rail, so that we can all enjoy the game at our own pace. and not feel like we're being, crushed by the amount of essaying and yapping that is endemic to Penacony at this point. So that is my thought on Penacony so far. I hope I didn't shit on both Genshin Impact and Honkai Star enough for you to give me a dislike. Please just, react the way you want to. I don't really care, to be honest. But I hope you understand that I'm not saying that Honkai Star or Genshin Impact are bad games. It's just that people enjoy different things. And the way that Honkai Star is going, I think there is going to be a significant portion of players that just fall off the game, even if the vast majority of online, opinions on it are positive. There are people who would prefer the story to not be as, immense as it has become. This is Bench Gamer signing out. I hope you guys enjoyed yourself. Bye bye.